and welcome. I'm Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks for joining us for The Future of Missile Defense, where we'll be exploring why the Pentagon and Congress are prioritizing a layered missile defense strategy now. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Raytheon Missiles and Defense, for its support of today's event. In President Biden's first speech to Congress, he named North Korea and Iran's nuclear programs as serious threats to American security and the security of the world. As we look at both present and emerging concerns, what areas of the U.S. threat landscape our missile defense leaders are prioritizing and why? What advanced capabilities will the Pentagon deploy to mitigate risk in the near and long terms? And what are the primary challenges facing American missile defense strategy? We're going to be putting these questions and more in front of our fantastic lineup of speakers. But first, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillDefense. We're broadcasting live and we'll take your questions throughout the program. And with any live stream, they say if it all goes down, just push refresh and it will come right back up. I am one still waiting to see that happen, but it'll happen for you. My first guest is Congressman Jim Cooper from Tennessee. He's the chair of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, which has jurisdiction over policy related to missile defense, nuclear weapons, strategic deterrence, and more. Congressman Cooper, a long time ago, about 30, 40 years ago, I read a book called Wizards of Armageddon, and it was about these early guys at Rand Corporation that were thinking through all the dimensions of what strategic deterrence and mutual assured destruction and what kinds of layers of defense we needed to have. And that was when, I guess, the Cold War was at its ripest. We're no longer in that same situation today, and I won't call you a wizard of Armageddon, maybe a wizard of space or a wizard of peace. But what are the key features that you think are really important, particularly with regards to missile defense?
Well, Steve, I'm glad to be with you. These are increasingly important topics. Even though we've been thinking about missile defense and preparing for 40 years, now with rogue states, and also with the threat of accidental launch from another country, we need to be prepared. And thank goodness our military is prepared. We have a layered defense now that should give us greater assurance that we are safe from any possible mistaken attack.
Do you think that when you're out there, when I just mentioned Iran and North Korea, are those the two sources that you worry about most in your profile? And I guess that's a sloppy way of me asking you, do you worry about non-state actors in the missile defense arena?
Well, we do worry about the rogue states the most. It's pretty hard for a terrorist organization to get the capability you need to launch any sort of missile. Now, there's some small rockets, such as, for example, Israel's been facing. But to hit the continental United States, it takes quite some doing. There's also a threat of accidental launch from one of the major states that have missiles galore. And we need to keep in mind the threat that accidents pose to our country.
Congressman Cooper, where are you right now in Russia? And I raise this because just this week, there were 65 national security leaders who have sent a letter to President Biden and said, in your discussions about the New START treaty and about arms control negotiations, particularly with the Russians, we ought to put missile defense on the table. Does that make sense from your perspective?
It's curious about missile defense. This is one of the few areas of American military capability that our peer rivals have exaggerated. They seem actually terrified of it and think that our capabilities are actually much greater than they are. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. Perhaps it's the modest name of the so-called Standard Missile, the key to the Aegis defense platform. Perhaps it's other things, but certainly the Russians and the Chinese have been extremely alarmed about our missile defense capabilities. They're particularly worried that somehow it might give us a first-strike capability, which I really don't know anyone in America is interested in. But it's really a touchy subject for Russia and for China.
Well, I remember, I think it was about 2 years ago now, you may remember that video that Vladimir Putin did, and it had, all of this graphics and a super hypersonic missile coming in saying we can take on anybody, we're technologically ahead and there's nothing that can stop us. And, it seemed like a gimmicky video at the time, but I know sometimes when leaders come out and brag, there could be some truth behind that. Are we, from your estimation, prepared for whatever the Russians have developed or developing by way of hypersonic missiles that could be used in such an attack?
Well, hypersonics are a threat, and we're developing our own capability, but other nations are rushing fast ahead. And it's not just hypersonic threats that Russia and China are throwing at us. The Putin press conference that you mentioned of 2 years ago was like a freak show of exotic and really unthinkable weapons. That could,
it was really weird.
Or hit us from the South Pole, or just, it was really the ultimate in saber rattling. But, you know, Russia is a declining nation. They have huge internal problems. Putin is making the best of a bad situation. But by over-investing in his nuclear and missile areas, pretty soon he won't even have the demographics to field a serious army the way their population is declining. China is the more serious threat, and they're beefing up their nuclear capability dramatically, as well as their hypersonic capability. So we need the ability to detect these threats and to protect America from them.
Where do you think we are right now with regards to North Korea? We went through kind of a nuclear dance with North Korea over the last few years with President Trump. We've come in. I can't tell which direction per se the Biden administration is going yet, but I've been watching North Korea for decades now, and I've never seen anything really make an impact on its very, very strong intentions to develop nuclear weapons, almost as negotiating chips to survive. But I'm wondering, from a military and a strategic perspective, and also right on the edge with our ally Japan, also looking at, instabilities with Taiwan that General Mark Milley and others have laid out as being of great concern with regards to China's intentions. That area just looks like it's full of fault lines. And I'm wondering, from a strategic and military perspective, there's one thing about defending the United States. There's nothing about missile defense and allies, and wondering how that fits in.
You raised some key issues there, and these are primarily Pacific and PACOM issues. Former President Trump's overtures to Kim Jong-un in North Korea were bizarre. President Trump was the only world leader, including the Chinese, to ever even meet with Kim Jong-un. And his attempted love affair did not pay off at all. All of Kim Jong-un has done is proceed with his missile and nuclear capabilities. He also raised the issue of extended deterrence. That's our relationship with our allies, whom we want to be using our nuclear umbrella of protection. We do not want them to proliferate nuclear technologies. And in large part, that has worked. But as the China threat grows, we need to hold China accountable to make them contain Kim Jong-un and North Korea. But we also need to protect our allies against Chinese threats, because in the South China Sea and other areas on the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, they're getting increasingly aggressive, and that should worry us all.
Mr. Chairman, about 45 years ago, I'm trying to think back, it's longer than I thought, when I did read Fred Kaplan's book, Wizards of Armageddon, and I was working as a young kid at Rand Corporation at that time, we had just kind of begun to think very, very non-seriously, I would say, about space. And it seems to me that is one of the major changes between the strategic terrain then and now. And many people look at you as the real founder, the father of the Space Corps, of Space Forces, and thinking through this. And I'd love you to share with our listeners what dimensions of space and security ought to be on our radar screen, so to speak.
Well, first, I'm glad you mentioned Fred Kaplan. It's not just his old book, The Wizards of Armageddon. It's his new book, The Bomb, which everybody should read if they want a concise history of what's been going on. And groups like RAND have played a key role, and I'm proud of your service there. As regards to space, we are so dependent on space for everything we do in our daily lives. We really have no idea. It's not just our TV and internet, it's our ATMs, our banking, all forms of internet communication. Without the space capabilities that our satellites give us, we would be crippled. And increasingly, rival nations are looking at ways of taking out our satellites. Hitherto, the space assets we had been unprotected, and we didn't fear for them at all. But now other nations are spending many billions of dollars to try to develop capabilities to destroy our satellites in that unfriendly domain. So we've really got to be careful here as space becomes a contested environment. And it's not me, the founder of Space Force, Mike Rogers and I, the congressman from Alabama. We're working very hard together in a bipartisan fashion to make sure that our Pentagon recognize the need to bolster our space capabilities. Unfortunately, our friends in the Air Force had given space a lower priority than it deserved. So Space Force had to grow into its own separate service. It's the first time that's happened since World War II. to have the creation of a brand new service. And I'm thankful for that. It's still fledgling. It's getting on its feet. But it's the guardians, as they're called, those who serve in the Space Force, will be key to America's and the world's future.
Mr. Chairman, I know that talking money is always complicated, but sometimes budgets is where things get real. I know there's been discussion not only just of the Space Forces in this new arena of this new separate force of the armed services, but also things like the Next Generation Interceptor and beginning to replace some of the elements of the layered missile defense system that we have. And I guess my question is, as you look into, you'll know better than I do, does the Biden budget put the right thumbs on the right resources for NGI, for Space Forces?
Overall, the Biden defense budget is very strong. It continues America's commitment to defend itself. And remember, this is the only part of the federal budget that we don't get to set. It's essentially set by our rivals around the world. And we have to be able to meet and beat anything that they throw at us. And that includes missiles. So whether you're looking at GBIs, our major missiles to defend against rogue attack, or our layered defense, which is also helpful, or many, many other aspects of our defense budget, I think the Biden budget is keeping faith with the American people and with our service members to keep America strong, to keep America number one, and really by far number one, because the whole free world depends on us, and we have to show leadership in this area. And as a percent of overall federal spending, our defense budget is actually a pretty small part. It looks large if you exclude many other parts of the budget, but in general, we're keeping on track to keep America strong.
Let me ask you a out of left field question, because I think, I don't think it would be wrong of Americans who care about this issue to wonder and worry about the state of our command and control when it came to our strategic forces. A few years ago, I interviewed General John Hyten, I think it's John Hyten, who was then head of the Strategic Air Command, and he would have been the last human being that President Trump would have spoken to before the launch of a nuclear weapon. And I asked General Hyten, I said, had you thought about what you're going to talk about with the president before taking that order? And without any prompting from me, he said to our audience, I will not execute an illegal order. And it made global headlines when he said that. But it also prompted the question of, wow, how sound, how predictable, how secure is our command and control? Because sometimes there are accidents. Sometimes there are moments where you wonder about the stability of leadership, whether back then or in the future. And I'm just wondering, this also comes into your domain of looking at. We've had reforms on defense decision-making in the past. Do you think we need any new reforms when it comes to those kinds of high-level decisions in our strategic capabilities?
We look at this area continuously, and everybody knows from TV movies that the president always has the nuclear football near him. And we need to worry about presidential judgment. We also need to worry whether the football works and whether it's in fact connected on a timely basis to our military assets. And I think now with President Biden, we should have little concern. He's the most experienced president we've had probably in American history. He's solid as a rock. And the football does work. Now, the football needs to be continually upgraded. We've got to make sure that it can't be jammed or spoofed or in any way taken offline. And I do think that our military, as exemplified by General Hyten and now by Admiral Richard, these are superb, highly trained professionals. They do what the Constitution requires, and that's to maintain civilian leadership of our military. Mm-hmm. And we need to always work on smarter and wiser civilian leadership to make sure that the Pentagon is led in an appropriate fashion by the current wonderful Secretary of Defense, Secretary Austin, and by civilian leaders in Congress who always guide the nation in the right path. But governance is a continuing struggle. We've survived well for almost 250 years now. We need to work on making sure the next 250 years are as successful.
Jim, let me just ask you one final question. I know we're running out of time, but I love this conversation. I haven't done it in a long time. But I used to work for Senator Jeff Bingaman, so we had 2 nuclear weapons laboratories in the state of New Mexico. And I used to hang out with the scientists that were really designing, the next generation systems in a lot of our strategic arsenal, if you will, and plutonium management and on. But I'm also very aware of friends of mine like Joe Cirincione and Jeffrey Lewis and others that have been saying, hey, we can go overboard. And I've always seen this interesting dance over the decades between those who worry about having too many tools in our our arsenal, and wanting arms control and restrictions, and then those that are trying to figure out every dimension of warfighting to protect this continent and nation against bad players in the world. And I've always been interested in whether that chemistry is where it should be. And I know you talk to all sides of it. Is the strategic defense of the country on all sides of the debate in a healthy place right now? Or do you think we need to kind of, all kind of open our eyes again and reacquaint ourselves with what strategic defense means?
Well, Steve, a healthy debate is what keeps us strong. And we need our miraculous defense labs like you have in New Mexico with Sandia and Los Alamos, and that we have in Tennessee with Oak Ridge, and there are others. And we need the groups like Plowshares and others, Union of Concerned Scientists, who help keep the debate honest, because no side has a monopoly on the truth. And it's the debate that keeps us focused. Now, I've been a little worried, and the Pentagon has seen this. A lot of the Cold War stuff got a little bit old and outmoded, and keeping the morale up with the truth so it's hard, because if you're guarding a missile field in North Dakota, you kind of wonder, well, how important is this? Especially when it's really cold outside. But I think we're seeing a new focus on these important issues, especially as China, a rising power, creates really a double threat against us, not only Russia, but also China. We've got to be prepared, because these countries are spending tens of billions of dollars to do everything they can to unsettle us, if not harm us. And we have to be ready, because it's not a Boy Scout, Girl Scout world out there. We have to be prepared, and that's the job of the Defense Department.
Well, Representative Jim Cooper, who is chairman of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, thank you so much for joining us today and for your candor on these really important issues.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it.